In 1887, in the unforgiving high country of the Montana Territory, a man named Caleb Mercer made a transaction that the locals in Bear Creek whispered about for decades. He didn't want love. He wanted a laborer. He paid off a family's debt in exchange for a wife strong enough to survive the winter. But when the wagon arrived, Caleb didn't get the sturdy workhorse he was promised. He got Clara a woman with a shattered leg and a spirit the world had tried to break. He planned to send her back the moment the snow cleared. He had no idea that the winter of '87 would be the deadliest in history, and that the broken woman in his cabin was the only thing standing between him and death. This is the story of how a rejection turned into a legend. The wind howling through jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains didn't sound like wind to Caleb Mercer. It sounded like a warning. Caleb stood on the porch of his cabin, a structure built from logs as thick as a man's torso, watching the narrow trail that snaked up from the valley floor. He was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains, 6'4", bearded with eyes the color of gunmetal, and hands that were permanently stained with pine pitch and gunpowder. At 32, he was already an old man in spirit. He lived alone, miles from the nearest neighbor, and he liked it that way. But a man couldn't run a trapping line, chop 10 cords of wood, and keep a homestead from collapsing all by himself. Not forever. "She's late," he muttered, his voice raspy from disuse. Beside him, his wolf dog Rusty whined low in his throat. Down the trail, a rickety buckboard wagon finally crested the ridge. The horse looked half-starved, ribs showing through its winter coat. The driver was a man Caleb knew only by reputation, Josiah Halloway, a gambler, a drinker, and a man who owed Caleb a significant sum of money for furs purchased on credit 3 years prior. Caleb stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the hard-packed frost. He didn't offer a hand as the wagon rattled to a halt. "You brought her," Caleb said flatly. Josiah jumped down, flashing a nervous, gap-toothed smile. "A deal's a deal, Mercer. My sister for the debt. She's a good girl. Quiet. Knows how to cook." Caleb ignored him and walked to the back of the wagon. Underneath a thin grey wool blanket sat a figure huddled against the biting cold. "Stand up," Caleb commanded. The figure moved slowly. A small, pale hand gripped the side of the wagon. As she rose, Caleb's eyes narrowed. She was small, too small. Her coat was threadbare, patched with mismatched fabric. But it was the way she moved that made Caleb's stomach turn cold. She winced as she put weight on her left leg, her body listing heavily to the side. She gripped the wagon wall knuckles white, struggling to keep her balance. Caleb looked back at Josiah, fury igniting in his chest. "She's crippled. She ain't crippled," Josiah spat, backing away slightly. "Just a bad break when she was a kid. Never set right. But she can work. She can sew, she can... I need a wife who can haul water." Caleb roared, his voice echoing off the trees. "I need a woman who can walk a trap line in 2 feet of snow if I get sick. You brought me a burden, Josiah, not a helpmate." The woman in the wagon didn't speak. She just lowered her head, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. She was shivering not just from the cold, but from the humiliation radiating off her in waves. Her name was Clara, and she had heard these words her entire life. Burden. Broken. Useless. "Take her back," Caleb growled, turning away. "The debt stands. I'll come down in spring to collect the money, or your hide." "I can't." Josiah scrambled into the driver's seat. "I'm heading to California. Wagon's loaded light. I ain't got room for her no more, Mercer. She's your problem now." Before Caleb could reach for the rifle leaning against the porch rail, Josiah cracked the whip. The starved horse bolted, turning the wagon in a sharp, reckless arc. "Josiah!" Clara screamed, her voice cracking. It was the first sound she had made. But the wagon was already careening down the trail, disappearing into the tree line. The sound of the wheels faded, leaving only the whistle of the wind. Caleb stood frozen, staring at the empty trail. He slowly turned back to the woman, left standing in the snow. Her small travel sack had been tossed onto the ground. She stood, leaning heavily on her good leg, her breath puffing in white clouds. She looked up at him then. Her eyes were a startling shade of amber, wide with terror, but holding a strange, defiant spark deep within. "I don't need charity," Caleb said, his voice hard. "And I don't run a hospital." Clara swallowed hard, clutching her shawl tighter. "I don't need a hospital, Mr. Mercer. I just need a place to sleep until the snow melts." "You think you can survive up here?" He stepped closer, towering over her. "With that leg, this mountain kills strong men, girl. It'll eat you alive before supper." "I've survived worse than a mountain," she whispered, her gaze dropping to his boots. Caleb let out a harsh breath through his nose. He looked at the sky. The clouds were thickening, turning a bruised purple over the peaks. A storm was coming. A big one. He couldn't leave a dog out in this, let alone a woman, no matter how useless she was to him. "Get inside," he barked, pointing to the door. "But don't get comfortable. First break in the weather. You're walking down to the settlement. I work alone." Clara nodded once, grabbed her bag, and limped toward the cabin. Every step was a battle, a jerk of pain and effort, but she didn't ask for help. Caleb watched her go, a sinking feeling in his gut. He had wanted a partner to help him conquer the wild. Instead, he'd been saddled with a bird with a broken wing. He didn't know it yet, but the break in the weather he promised wouldn't come for 3 months. The interior of the cabin was warm, smelling of cedar smoke and curing meat. It was a masculine space, sparse, utilitarian, and impeccably clean. A large stone hearth dominated one wall with a cast-iron pot simmering over the coals. Clara stood by the door, afraid to touch anything. She had spent the last 10 years of her life in her brother's attic, hidden away like a shameful secret, because no suitor wanted a wife who couldn't dance. She was 24 years old, but she felt ancient. Caleb entered behind her, kicking the snow off his boots. The noise made her jump. "Bed's in the corner," he said, gesturing to a sturdy wooden frame with a straw mattress covered in furs. "I'll sleep by the fire." "I can sleep on the floor," Clara said quickly. "I don't want to put you out." "You take the bed," Caleb said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If your leg seizes up in the cold, I'm the one who has to drag you out." He walked past her, ignoring her flinch, and went to the stove. He ladled stew into 2 tin bowls and slammed them onto the rough-hewn table. "Eat." They ate in silence. The only sounds were the scraping of spoons and the rising wind outside. The storm Caleb had sensed was arriving. The cabin walls creaked as the gusts slammed against them. Caleb watched her from under his heavy brows. She ate delicately, despite looking like she hadn't seen a full meal in weeks. She had high cheekbones and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. "What happened to it?" Caleb asked suddenly, nodding toward her leg hidden under the table. Clara paused, her spoon hovering halfway to her mouth. "Horse kick. When I was 12. Bone shattered. The doctor, he wasn't very good. Why didn't your brother reset it?" "Josiah didn't want to pay for a second visit," she said simply. There was no self-pity in her voice, just a factual recitation of neglect. Caleb grunted. He knew men like Josiah. The West was full of them, men who saw people as commodities. "You realize what happens now," Caleb said, leaning back. "Snow's starting. That pass will be closed by morning. You're stuck here." "I know how to sew," Clara offered, desperation creeping into her tone. "I can mend your clothes. I can skin rabbits. I can cook better than this." She gestured to the stew. Caleb's eyes flashed. "This stew has kept me alive for 5 years." "It's burnt," she said softly. Caleb stared at her. For a second he looked ready to throw her out into the snow. Then a short, sharp bark of laughter escaped him. It sounded rusty, like a gate hinge. "Burnt," he repeated. "Right. Well, Miss Holloway, you're welcome to the kitchen. But if you slow me down outside, you stay inside. Understood. The first week fell into a tense rhythm. Clara was true to her word. She took over the domestic duties with a ferocity that surprised Caleb. Despite her limp, she moved efficiently around the small space. She scrubbed the floors, reorganized his pantry, and yes, the food improved drastically. She found dried herbs he had ignored and used them to season the venison. But the tension remained. Caleb was a man of solitude. He resented the extra noise, the extra breath in the air. He resented that he found himself watching her in the evenings as she sat by the fire, mending his torn shirts. The firelight danced on her dark hair, and for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a home. That terrified him. He dealt with it by being cruel. One morning, the snow had stopped, leaving a fresh 3 feet of powder. Caleb geared up to check his traps. "I'm going to the North Ridge," he announced. "Let me come," Clara said, standing up from her chair. "I can carry the small pack. I need fresh air." "No," Caleb snapped. "Snow's too deep. You'll drag behind. I can't be looking over my shoulder every 5 minutes to see if you've fallen in a drift. I'm stronger than I look, Caleb." She used his first name for the first time. It hung in the air between them. "You're a liability," he said, cold, grabbing his rifle. "Stay here. Keep the fire hot. That's all you're good for." He slammed the door, leaving her standing in the center of the room. He didn't see the tears that welled in her eyes, nor did he see the way she angrily wiped them away and grabbed the heavy water buckets to haul snow for melting. She would not cry for him. She would not cry for any man. Caleb stayed out longer than usual that day, driven by a guilt he couldn't name. He pushed himself hard through the drifts, checking traps, resetting snares. The physical exertion was a drug numbing his mind. By late afternoon, the sky turned a milky white. The temperature plummeted. The wind shifted, coming from the north with a bite that froze the moisture in his nose instantly. Caleb stopped, looking up at the peaks. The silence of the woods was heavy, unnatural. The birds had vanished. Another storm, and this one felt different. It felt angry. He turned back toward the cabin, picking up his pace. He was 3 miles out. He could make it back before the worst hit. But the mountain had other plans. As he crossed a frozen creek bed, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A crack. Not of ice, but of wood. He looked up just as a dead pine, weighed down by the heavy snow and weakened by the wind, gave way. He tried to dive, but the snow slowed him down. The heavy branch clipped his shoulder, spinning him around, and sent him crashing hard onto the ice. His head struck a rock protruding from the bank. Blackness swarmed his vision. He tried to stand, but the world tilted violently. Pain exploded in his shoulder and head. He slumped back down, the cold seeping into his bones instantly. "Get up," he hissed to himself. "Get up, you fool." But his limbs felt like lead. The snow began to fall soft at first, then harder, thicker. It began to cover his boots, his legs. Back at the cabin, Clara looked out the frosted window. The sun was gone. The wind was screaming again. And Caleb wasn't back. She waited an hour, then 2. Darkness had fully descended. She looked at the warm fire. She looked at her bad leg. She remembered his words. "You're a liability." "No," she whispered. She went to the corner and grabbed Caleb's spare, heavy coat. She wrapped sorvillas and scarves around her face. She found his old snowshoes hanging on the wall. She had never used them, but she understood the mechanics. She lit the kerosene lantern. "You stubborn fool," she muttered, opening the door into the howling white void. "If you die out there, I'm going to kill you." Clara Holloway, the broken bride, stepped out into the deadliest blizzard of the decade to find the husband who didn't want her. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It was a physical force, a wall of ice that shoved Clara backward with every step. The lantern, swinging from her gloved hand, cast a pitifully small circle of yellow light, barely illuminating the snowshoes she had strapped to her feet. She had never walked in snowshoes before. They were clumsy, heavy things made of ashwood and rawhide, designed for a man twice her size. Every time she lifted her left leg, the bad one agony shot up her hip and settled in the base of her spine. It felt like grinding glass. "Turn back," a voice in her head whispered. "You'll die out here. He's probably already dead." Clara gritted her teeth, tasting the iron tang of blood where the cold had cracked her lip. "No," she said aloud, her voice snatched away by the gale immediately. "I didn't survive Josiah's beatings just to freeze to death in a hole." She followed the faint depression in the snow that marked Caleb's trail, but the fresh powder was filling it in fast. If she didn't find him in the next 20 minutes, the trail would be gone, and he would be part of the mountain until spring. She walked for what felt like hours, though it might have only been 30 minutes. Her eyelashes froze together. Her fingers wrapped in 2 pairs of wool mittens were numb. Then she heard it. A howl. Not a wolf, but a dog. "Rusty!" She screamed, the sound tearing at her throat. The howl came again, closer. She pushed forward, dragging her left leg, forcing her body to obey through sheer will. Through the swirling whiteout, a dark shape emerged. It was the wolf dog, Rusty. He was circling a mound in the snow, digging frantically. Clara fell to her knees, discarding the lantern. She crawled the last few feet. Rusty whined and licked her face, his fur matted with ice. "Where is he?" she gasped. She dug into the snowbank Rusty had been guarding. Her mittens struck something hard. A shoulder, a coat. She brushed the snow away frantically. Caleb lay curled on his side, half buried. His skin was the color of blue clay. His eyes were closed, crusted with ice. A nasty gash on his forehead had bled sluggishly before freezing over. "Caleb!" She shook him. He was a dead weight. "Caleb, wake up!" He groaned, a sound barely audible over the wind. "Sarah," he mumbled. "Cold." Clara didn't know who Sarah was, and she didn't care. She checked his pulse. It was faint and thready. He was hypothermic. If she didn't get him moving, his heart would stop. "I can't carry you," she sobbed, looking at his massive frame. He was over 200 pounds of muscle. She was barely 100 pounds, soaking wet. She looked around. The tree line was miles away. The cabin was uphill. She remembered the small coil of rope she had seen attached to his belt earlier that day. She fumbled for it, her numb fingers clumsy. She unhooked it. "I'm sorry," she whispered to his unconscious form. "This is going to hurt." She tied the rope around his chest under his arms. Then she looped the other end around her own waist, tying it tight. She stood up the snowshoes, finding purchase. "Rusty, home," she commanded, pointing into the dark. The dog seemed to understand. He trotted forward. Clara leaned forward, digging the snowshoes into the ice, and pulled. The rope bit into her waist. The weight was immovable. She screamed in frustration and pain, her bad leg buckling. She fell. "Get up." She stood up again. She leaned at a 45-degree angle, using her entire body weight as a lever. Slowly, agonizingly, Caleb's body slid 6 inches. Then another 6 inches. "One step," she panted. "Just one step." The journey back was a blur of torture. Every step was a battle against physics and biology. Her left leg went numb, then burned, then went numb again. She fell a dozen times. Once she vomited from the exertion, the bile freezing instantly in the snow. She talked to him the whole time, a stream of nonsense to keep herself awake. "You are not dying on me, Caleb Mercer. You owe me a dinner. You owe me a warm bed. You are a rude, arrogant, stubborn mule of a man, and I am not going to be a widow before I'm barely a wife." She didn't know how long it took. Time lost its meaning. There was only the rope, the snow, and the pain. When the dark outline of the cabin finally appeared in the gloom, Clara thought she was hallucinating. Rusty barked at the door. She dragged him up the shallow steps of the porch, sobbing with relief. The door was the hardest part. She had to untie herself, open it, and then drag him over the threshold. As she pulled him inside and kicked the door shut against the howling demon wind, the warmth of the cabin hit her like a hammer. She collapsed on the floor beside him, her lungs burning her leg, throbbing with a pulse that felt like it would shatter the bone all over again. She lay there for a minute, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the fire crackle. She had done the impossible. But as she looked over at Caleb, she realized the night was far from over. He wasn't shivering anymore, and that was a very bad sign. Clara forced herself up. Her legs were trembling so violently she had to hold on to the table to stand. She ignored her own pain. That could wait. She knelt beside Caleb. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and erratic. She touched his face. It was ice cold, but beneath the skin she could feel the heat of a fever trying to ignite. "Clothes," she muttered. "Wet clothes off." It was a struggle to strip the heavy, frozen layers from his dead weight. She had to cut his boots off with a skinning knife because the laces were frozen solid. When she finally got him down to his long johns, she saw the extent of the damage. His entire right side was a deep, angry purple. The tree branch had broken ribs, maybe a collarbone. But the hypothermia was the immediate killer. She dragged the mattress from the bed frame closer to the fire. It took every ounce of strength she had left. She rolled him onto it. He needed body heat. The blankets wouldn't be enough. Clara hesitated only for a second. She stripped off her own sodden dress and petticoats, shivering in the cool air of the cabin until she was in her chemise. She piled every fur and quilt they owned on top of him. Then she slid under the mound of blankets, pressing her body against his side. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his neck. "Warm up," she whispered. "Please, Caleb." For hours he didn't move. Clara lay awake, listening to the wind try to tear the roof off. She rubbed his arms, his chest, trying to generate friction. Around midnight, the shivering started. It was violent. Caleb's teeth chattered so hard she thought they would crack. His muscles seized and spasmed. This was good. It meant his body was fighting to warm up. But it was terrifying to watch. "Sarah!" he shouted suddenly, his eyes flying open but seeing nothing. He thrashed his arm, flailing out and hitting Clara in the shoulder. "Shh, I'm here," Clara soothed, pinning his arm down. "It's okay." "Don't go," he rasped, tears leaking from his eyes. "The ice, it's too thin." "Sarah, don't walk there." Clara froze. She realized she was hearing the ghosts that haunted this cabin. Josiah had told her Caleb was a widower, but the details had been scarce. "I've got you," Clara said softly, stroking his hair tangled and damp with sweat. "You're safe. You're not on the ice." "I couldn't save her," he wept, his voice breaking into a ragged sob that tore at Clara's heart. The big granite mountain man was reduced to a frightened child. "I wasn't strong enough." "You are strong," Clara whispered fiercely. "You are the strongest man I know." He burned with fever for 2 days. Clara didn't sleep. She only left the bed to stoke the fire-melt snow for water and force broth down his throat when he was lucid enough to swallow. She changed his bandages. She bathed his forehead with cool rags. She forgot about her own leg. She forgot about her brother. Her entire world narrowed down to the rise and fall of Caleb's chest. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm broke. Sunlight, brilliant and blinding, streamed through the frosted window pane. Caleb groaned. The sound was different this time, deeper, grounded in reality. He blinked, his eyelashes fluttering. He tried to move, but a groan of pain escaped him as his broken ribs protested. He turned his head. Clara was asleep in a chair next to the mattress, her head resting on her arms on the edge of the bed. Her hair was loose, falling like a dark curtain over her face. Her hand was resting on his chest as if checking his heart, even in her sleep. Caleb stared at her. His memory was a fragmented mess of white snow pain and a voice. A soft, relentless voice pulling him back from the dark. I am not going to be a widow before I'm barely a wife. He looked down at himself. He was bandaged, clean, warm. He looked at the woman. He saw the dark circles under her eyes. He saw the way her hand was chapped and red. And then he saw her leg. She had propped it up on a stool, and the ankle was swollen to twice its normal size, turning a sickly shade of blue-black. Realization hit him like a physical blow. She had gone out. She, the woman he had called a cripple, the woman he had deemed useless, had walked into a blizzard that had nearly killed him. She had dragged him a man twice her weight back home. Caleb reached out his hand, shaking, and gently touched the bruised skin of her cheek. Clara jerked awake instantly. Caleb. Her eyes were wide, panic-stricken. Are you okay? Is the fever back? She moved to check his forehead, but he caught her wrist. His grip was weak but firm. You came for me, he said. His voice was gravel rough and deep. Clara pulled back, slightly self-conscious. You would have done the same. No, Caleb said, looking her dead in the eye. I wouldn't have. Not for a stranger. Not with that leg. Clara looked away. I did what had to be done. You shouldn't be alive, Caleb said, his eyes scanning her. How did you drag me? I don't know, she admitted softly. Caleb looked at her swollen ankle. You hurt yourself. It's an old injury, Caleb. It's always hurt. It always will. He didn't let go of her wrist. He rubbed his thumb over her pulse point. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through Clara that had nothing to do with the cold. I called you a burden. Caleb said, the shame evident in his tone. I was wrong. You're the only reason I'm breathing. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. It was the first time in her life a man had looked at her with something other than pity or disgust. He looked at her with awe. Are you hungry? She asked, her voice trembling desperately, needing to break the intensity of the moment. Caleb smiled. It was small, tight with pain, but it was real. Starving. But Clara, she paused. Thank you. Recovery was slow. The blizzard had dumped 10 feet of snow on the mountain, sealing them in completely. Even if they wanted to leave, they couldn't. They were trapped in a world that ended at the cabin walls. For the first 2 weeks, Caleb was bedridden. The broken ribs made movement agony. This meant the roles were completely reversed. Clara, the invalid, became the provider. She chopped the kindling inside the cabin because she couldn't swing the axe outside. She hauled the water. She cooked. She cared for Rusty. Caleb watched her from the bed. He watched the way she bit her lip when she stood up after sitting for too long. He watched the efficiency of her movements. He realized that her brokenness had forged a terrifying kind of resilience in her. She didn't fight the pain. She worked with it. The dynamic in the cabin shifted. The silence wasn't hostile anymore. It was companionable. They started talking. Really talking. Tell me about Sarah, Clara said one evening. The fire was dying down, casting long shadows. She was mending his shirt again. Caleb stiffened. He hadn't spoken her name since the fever. She was my wife, he said, staring at the ceiling. 10 years ago. We lived down in the valley. She was gentle. Too gentle for this place. What happened? She went through the ice on the river. I was 50 yards away. I ran, but I wasn't fast enough. The current took her under. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made it all the more heartbreaking. I came up here after that. Figured if I lived where no one else could, I couldn't fail anyone else. You didn't fail me, Clara said softly. Caleb turned his head to look at her. Not yet. Stop that, she said, putting down her needle. Stop waiting for the other shoe to drop, Caleb. You're alive. I'm alive. We're eating. We're warm. We're low on meat, he countered. It was true. The storm had lasted longer than expected, and Caleb hadn't been able to hunt. The venison was gone. They were down to dried beans and a little flour. I'll check the snares tomorrow, Clara said. No, Caleb growled, trying to sit up. You are not going out there alone again. There are wolves. I heard them last night. You can't walk, Caleb. If I don't check the snares, we starve. Is that the plan? I can walk, he lied. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed and stood up. His face went grey. He swayed, clutching his ribs, sweat popping out on his forehead. Clara was there in an instant, her hands on his waist to steady him. You stubborn, idiotic man, she scolded, but her voice was breathless. They were standing very close. Caleb looked down at her. She was looking up, her amber eyes fierce and worried. The smell of her soap and wood smoke filled his senses. The adrenaline of the argument faded, replaced by a thick, heavy tension. Caleb's hand moved from her shoulder to the nape of her neck. His rough fingers tangled in her hair. Clara, he breathed. He leaned down. Clara rose on her tiptoes. Their lips met. It wasn't a tentative, shy kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of survival and pent-up longing. Caleb groaned low in his throat, pulling her flush against him. His hands roamed down her back, pressing her closer. Clara wrapped her arms around his neck, careful of his ribs opening to him. For a moment, the cold, the hunger, the snow, it all vanished. There was only the heat of him. Then Caleb pulled back abruptly. He gasped, his eyes wide, with something like panic. He pushed her away, gently but firmly. No, he said, turning his back to her. No, I can't do this. Clara stood frozen, her lips still tingling. Caleb, you need to go, he said, gripping the mantle of the fireplace until his knuckles turned white. As soon as the snow melts, you're going back to civilization. I'll give you money. You can start over. What? Clara felt like he had slapped her. After everything, you're sending me away. I am a dangerous man to be around. Clara, everyone I love dies. I won't watch it happen to you. I won't bury you on this mountain. You don't get to decide that for me. She shouted, tears of rage springing to her eyes. I saved your life. I earned my place here. And that's why you have to leave. Caleb turned his face, tormented. Because I'm starting to care about you. And that is a death sentence. You're a coward, she whispered. You're not protecting me. You're protecting yourself. She grabbed her shawl and retreated to the far corner of the cabin, turning her back on him. The silence that night was suffocating. Caleb lay in bed, staring at the fire, hating himself. Clara lay on a pallet she had made on the floor, her heart aching more than her leg ever had. But the mountain wasn't done with them. 2 days later, the food ran out completely, and the wolves Caleb had heard. They were getting closer. They could smell the weakness inside the cabin. They weren't just hungry. They were desperate. And a desperate pack doesn't wait for prey to come out. They come in. Hunger is a quiet thing at first. It's a nagging in the belly. But after 3 days without substantial food, it becomes a roar in the mind. It sharpens the senses, even as it dulls the body. Inside the cabin, the silence was heavier than the snowdrifts outside. Caleb and Clara moved around each other like ghosts, the memory of that rejected kiss hanging between them like a loaded weapon. Caleb was healing his ribs, knitting, but the lack of food was sapping the strength he needed to recover. He was irritable, pacing the small confines of the cabin like a caged panther, furious at his own helplessness. Clara, meanwhile, seemed to shrink. The reserves of energy she had used to save him were gone. Her limp was more pronounced, her face gaunt. But her eyes remained hard, refusing to show weakness to the man who had told her she had to leave. The wolves knew. It started on the 4th night of starvation. The howling stopped. It was replaced by scratching. Rusty, usually a calm sentinel, was pacing by the door, the hackles on his back raised into a rigid mohawk of fur. A low, continuous growl vibrated in his chest. "They're testing the perimeter," Caleb said, his voice tight. He was sitting at the table cleaning his rifle for the 5th time that day. His hands were steady, but his face was pale. "Can they get in?" Clara asked from her corner, where she was boiling snow water just to have something warm in their stomachs. "If they want to badly enough," Caleb admitted. He looked at the heavy wooden bar across the door. "The door will hold. The windows." He looked at the single window near the hearth. It was small, covered with thick oiled paper and heavy wooden shutters, but the wood was old, dried out by years of heat from the fire. The scratching grew louder. It wasn't just at the door now. It was on the roof. The sound of claws, skittering on the shingles above their heads, was maddening. Then a heavy thud shook the cabin wall. "They're throwing themselves at the logs," Caleb muttered, standing up. He winced as his ribs protested. He grabbed the rifle, trying to find a weak spot. Another thud, harder this time, against the window shutters. Wood cracked. "Get back," Caleb ordered, positioning himself between Clara and the window. "Get in the corner behind the bed. If they get in, stay down." Clara didn't argue. She grabbed her skinning knife, a pitiful defense against a timber wolf, but better than nothing, and retreated. The attack happened fast. There was a snarling roar outside, followed by a massive impact. The old shutters splintered inward. Glass and oiled paper shattered. A grey snout, snarling and snapping, shoved through the opening. Caleb fired. The boom of the Winchester was deafening in the small space. The wolf yelped and fell back. "Reloading!" Caleb shouted, his fingers flying. Before he could chamber another round, a second wolf, larger and darker than the first, launched itself through the broken window. It landed on the kitchen table and sliding on the wood, overturning the lantern. Fire flared across the floorboards. Rusty launched himself at the intruder. The two animals became a blur of fur and teeth in the flickering firelight. Caleb leveled the rifle, but he couldn't shoot without hitting his dog. "Rusty down." The wolf shook Rusty off, throwing the dog against the hearthstones with a sickening crack. Rusty yelped and didn't get up. The wolf turned its yellow eyes on Caleb. It crouched to spring. Caleb braced himself, ignoring the agony in his chest. He fired. The bullet hit the wolf in the shoulder, but the momentum carried the beast forward. It slammed into Caleb, knocking him backward onto the floor. The rifle skittered out of reach. The wolf was on top of him, its jaws snapping centimeters from his throat. Caleb jammed his forearm into the animal's neck, holding it back with brute strength, but he was weak from hunger and injury. His arm began to tremble. The wolf's saliva dripped onto his face. "Clara," he choked out. "Run!" He expected her to be cowering in the corner. He expected her to be paralyzed with fear, the way Sarah had been when the ice cracked. But Clara Holloway was not Sarah Mercer. She was a woman who had lived in an attic for a decade, a woman who had walked through a blizzard on a shattered leg. She didn't run. Caleb saw movement in his peripheral vision. Clara was moving toward them. She wasn't limping. She was charging, the skinning knife held high in a two-handed grip. Her face wasn't terrified. It was a mask of pure primal rage. She threw her entire body weight onto the wolf's back. She drove the knife down, burying it to the hilt in the animal's side, just behind the shoulder blade. The wolf roared in pain, releasing Caleb and thrashing wildly to dislodge the knife and the woman attached to it. Clara was thrown off, landing hard against the table leg. The wounded wolf turned on her, blood pouring from its side eyes, insane with pain and fury. It lunged at Clara. A deafening crack filled the room. The wolf stopped mid-air, dropped like a stone, and slid across the floor to Clara's feet. It twitched once and went still. Clara looked up, gasping for air. Caleb was sitting up against the wall, the smoking rifle back in his hands. He had crawled for it while she distracted the beast. Silence rushed back into the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the spilled oil burning on the floorboards and Rusty's pained whimpering from the hearth. Caleb stared at Clara. She was covered in blood. Hers the wolf's he couldn't tell. Her hair was wild, her chest heaving. She looked at the dead wolf at her feet, then at the knife still in her hand. She looked at Caleb, and then the adrenaline crashed. She began to shake violently. The knife clattered to the floor. Caleb dragged himself up. He ignored the screaming pain in his ribs. He stumbled across the room and grabbed her by the shoulders just as her knees gave out. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her hair, rocking her back and forth. "You crazy fool," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion he could no longer suppress. "You crazy brave fool." She clung to him, sobbing into his shirt. She had killed. She had saved him. Again. "Is it dead?" she mumbled against his chest. "It's dead," Caleb promised fiercely. "They're gone. You did it, Clara. You saved us." He looked over her head at the broken window, at the snow blowing in at the carnage in his home. He realized then that the mountain hadn't broken this woman. It had just revealed the steel that had always been underneath the skin. And he knew, with terrifying certainty, that he could never let her go. The carcass of the wolf hung in the shed, frozen solid. It was a grim trophy, but it was also their larder. For the next 3 weeks, they survived on the meat of the beast that had tried to kill them. It was tough, stringy, and tasted faintly of iron and pine, but every bite felt like a victory. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted into something unrecognizable. The violence of the attack had stripped away the last layers of polite distance between Caleb and Clara. They moved around the small space with a synchronized intimacy that usually took married couples decades to forge. Caleb's ribs were healing, though they still ached when the pressure dropped. He spent his days whittling by the fire, but his eyes rarely left Clara. He watched her limp across the floorboards, no longer seeing a defect, but a badge of honor. He watched the way her hands, now rougher and scarred, deftly mended the tear in his coat, where the wolf's claws had snagged. She had saved him. The thought replayed in his mind like a loop he couldn't stop. He, the great Caleb Mercer, the man who claimed to need no one, would be a frozen corpse in a drift or a meal for a pack, if not for the broken woman Josiah Halloway had dumped on his porch. But with the survival came a new suffocating dread. February bled into March. The sun began to linger longer on the peaks. The relentless howling wind that had battered the cabin for months began to lose its teeth. One morning, a sound broke the silence that Caleb had grown to fear. Drip, drip, drip. Caleb lay in bed, staring at the ceiling beams. It was the sound of snow melting off the roof. It was the sound of the pass opening. Across the room, Clara was already awake. She was sitting on the edge of her pallet, her back to him. She heard it too. Her shoulders were rigid. For Clara, the sound of the dripping water was a countdown. The deal was simple shelter for the winter. The winter was ending. She stood up, her bad leg stiff from the damp morning air, and moved to the stove. She didn't look at Caleb. She couldn't. If she looked at him, she might beg, and she had promised herself she would never beg a man for a place in his life again. "The creek will rise today," Caleb said, his voice rough with sleep. Clara paused in grinding the coffee beans, the last handful they had. "I suppose it will. Road will be my mud for a week, then hard pan. Then I should start packing," Clara said, her voice devoid of emotion. "My brother, or someone, will likely come up to check on the property." "Property," Caleb repeated the word, tasting like ash. The cabin, she clarified quickly, though they both knew Josiah considered her property too. The next few days were an agony of outspoken words. The cabin, which had felt like a warm cocoon during the storms, now felt like a waiting room for an execution. Caleb spent hours outside chopping wood he didn't need, trying to exhaust the turmoil in his chest. He was terrified. The old ghosts were screaming at him. Sarah died because you loved her. You are a curse, Caleb. Let this girl go. Let her find a soft life in a town with a doctor and sidewalks. But every time he came back inside and saw Clara, saw the way she had placed a jar of early pine sprigs on the table, saw the way she hummed while she worked, the thought of the empty silence returning was unbearable. On the 5th day of the thaw, Clara dragged her trunk to the center of the room. It was the same battered trunk she had arrived with. She began folding her few dresses. They were looser now. She had lost weight, her cheekbones sharper, her eyes tender and more haunted. Caleb stood by the hearth, watching her. The silence stretched until it snapped. "Leave it," he barked. Clara froze, a grey wool stocking in her hand. "What? The trunk? Leave it. You can't carry it down the mountain in the mud." "I'll drag it if I have to," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm good at dragging things, remember." It was a sharp retort, referencing the night she had hauled his body through the snow. It hit its mark. Caleb flinched. "I'm giving you money," Caleb said, reaching for a tin box on the mantel. "Enough for a stagecoach to San Francisco. You can set yourself up. Open a dress shop. You sew good." Clara slowly dropped the stocking into the trunk. She turned to face him, her amber eyes burning with a sudden fierce heat. "Is that what this was to you?" she asked quietly. "A job I kept you alive. I cooked your food. I warmed your bed when you were dying, and now you're paying me off like a servant." "It's not a payoff," Caleb roared, slamming the tin box down. "It's a chance. Look at you, Clara. You're gaunt. You're exhausted. This life, it nearly killed us both. I am trying to save you." "From what?" she shouted back, stepping toward him, her limp forgotten. "From the wolves. We killed them. From the cold. We beat it. Or are you trying to save me from yourself?" Caleb turned away, gripping the rough wood of the mantel until his knuckles turned white. "You don't know what it's like. To wake up every morning terrified that the person you love is going to be snatched away because you weren't fast enough or strong enough. I know exactly what it's like." Clara grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "I lived in an attic for 10 years, Caleb. I was hidden away because I was broken. I was terrified every single day that Josiah would just stop feeding me. I know fear. But I am not afraid of this mountain, and I am not afraid of you. I am cursed," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Sarah. I am not Sarah." Clara's voice rang through the cabin, authoritative and final. "I am Clara, and I am still here. The winter didn't break me. The wolves didn't break me. You are the only thing that can break me now, Caleb Mercer, by sending me away." She let go of his arm and stepped back, her chest heaving. "But if you want me to go," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "if you truly want to be alone in this house with your ghosts, then say it. Look me in the eye and tell me you don't want me. Don't tell me it's for my safety. Tell me you don't love me." Caleb looked at her. He saw the firelight dancing in her eyes. He saw the scar on her chin from the windburn. He saw the woman who had rewritten the definition of strength for him. He opened his mouth to lie, to say the words that would send her away and keep her safe. But he couldn't. The lie died in his throat. "I can't," he rasped. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't grab her. He fell into her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of wood smoke and resilience that was uniquely hers. "I can't send you away," he mumbled against her skin. "God help me, I can't do it. I'd go mad within a week." Clara let out a sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, and wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, holding him as tightly as she had that night in the snow. "Then don't," she wept. "Just let me stay." Caleb pulled back his large hands, framing her face. His thumbs wiped away the tears tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "Not as a housekeeper," he said firmly, "and not as a debt payment." He reached into his pocket. He didn't have a ring, there were no jewelers in the high country, but he pulled out a small object he had been carving for the last 3 weeks by the fire. It was a hairpin, whittled from the heartwood of a resilient mountain ash. He had carved it into the shape of a feather, delicate but unbreakable. "I have nothing to offer you but this cabin, a lot of hard work, and a man with a lot of scars," Caleb said, his voice steadying. "But everything I have is yours. I want you to be my wife, Clara. My real wife. My partner." Clara took the hairpin. Her fingers brushing his, she looked from the simple gift to the man standing before her, the mountain man who had tried to reject her, and in doing so had saved her life as much as she had saved his. "It's beautiful," she whispered. She looked up at him, a radiant smile breaking through the tears. "And yes, I will be your wife. But on one condition." Caleb blinked, surprised. "Name it." "You have to promise to never ever complain about my cooking again, even if I burn the stew." Caleb let out a laugh, a loud, booming sound that shook the dust from the rafters. It was the sound of a man who had finally come back to life. "Deal," he said. He kissed her then. It wasn't the desperate kiss of survival, nor the tentative kiss of curiosity. It was a kiss of claiming. Deep, slow, and full of a promise that was stronger than the winter. Outside, the last heavy sheet of snow slid off the roof with a thunderous crash, exposing the shingles to the sun. The creek roared in the valley below, alive and flowing. The winter of 1887 was over, but in the cabin on the ridge, life was just beginning. They say that spring in the Bitterroots is the most beautiful thing on earth, but only because you have to survive hell to see it. Caleb Mercer wanted a laborer and got a savior. Clara Halloway wanted a shelter and found her strength. In the end, the transaction that the town whispered about became a love story that became a legend. They lived in that cabin for 50 years. They raised 3 children there. And it's said that Caleb never let another winter pass without telling his wife that she was the only reason the spring out ever came at all. If you enjoyed this story of survival and unexpected love in the Wild West, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Share this with someone who believes that even the most broken things can be mended with enough courage. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next trail.